I'm glad to be here with you. I recognize some faces I've seen before. Other faces are new, and that's always good. Now, one of the most important things about all of us, we're all professional talkers, are we not? Because what do we do in class and in school every day? Talk. And you know one thing about professional talkers? You can fill up any amount of time people give you. So if they give you an hour, no problem. If they give you 2 hours, no problem. We can fill it up. So one of the things I have to do when I get up to speak is I have to remind myself how much time I have. So this is just kind of fun for you if you've never used this before. There is a free app called Perfection Timer. Perfection Timer. You can go to the iOS store or Google Play and find it. What I like about it is you can set the time, whatever you want to set it at. You can hit start. It starts counting down. And then what happens, the screen doesn't go dark. So I'm actually going to lay this up here. So I'm watching the time that we have. And then when I go over, instead of green, it starts counting the other way and goes red and says, you're in trouble, okay? You need to stop. As we get started today, just so you understand my background, I started out as a math science teacher at the high school level. I've taught most of the grades from 6 to 12. After I had done that for a number of years, I became a department head like some of you, then became a building principal in the district I was in. Actually, I have been with McGraw Hill for about 16 years now in this role, and I work with our trainers that work all across the U.S. and many times internationally. So we're going to take you through some ideas today. Let me start out by giving you a little preface, okay? We're going to look at 3 specific pedagogical opportunities in the classroom. These are not new, but they have a different emphasis in our schools today because of some of the research that's been done. And that research looks at what impacts students' learning, and then even more than that, what helps students internalize the learning. So we want to take a look at how that takes place. And then the other thing about it, by the way, this would help me. Unfortunately, for those of you that are streaming, I can't see your hands. But in the room right now, how many of you are still teaching in the classroom? Okay. So put your hands down. How many of you are primary grade? You're teaching primary grades. What about middle grades? High school? Oh, quite a few high school. How many of you are administrators, building heads, or, okay, good. That helps me, and I know, I know those joining us online, there's a lot of those different factors as well. The thing I want you to know about all 3 that we're going to talk about today, all 3 of these you could take back and start looking in your classroom or in your building about what am I doing and how could I change my pedagogical approach based on the things we're going to look at. Where do these come from? 1, they come from research. 2, they come from my experience. But sitting in this room, we have 60 or 70 times the experience that I have, and then when we join the hundreds of people online, you magnify that. So one thing I want to encourage you today, take some time to talk to each other. We're going to give you some breaks. There's going to be coffee break. Take some time to talk about some of these things, because actually the best ideas we have come from each other. So you have a series of experts in this room. Now, some of this is my opinion. You are free to disagree with that. You are free to be wrong. I'm just kidding, okay? You can disagree with me, you know, because some of this we all have different experiences we go through. Now, the 3 pedagogical pieces I want to take a look at, the first one we're going to do is we're going to look at intentional student discourse. The second one, we're going to talk about instructional routines and using them in our classroom. The third one is a little farther out there. My intention with this is more to get you thinking about it. It's an approach to learning called mastery-based learning that ties directly to how we do grading in our schools. We're going to talk about that. Now, if I had unlimited time, I would add 2 more to this. One of those would be data-driven instruction. What is actual data-driven instruction? The other one is problem-based or project-based learning. In the science session, we're going to talk a little bit about that today. But the reason I'm kind of holding off on these One, when we first started doing this, I had this one in the presentation and I never got to it, so I just took it out, okay? This one, I actually spent time on when we were here last year. For those of you that came again, I didn't want to repeat the same thing. But one of the most important things that we can do in our classrooms with our students is actually institute problem or project-based learning with them, where they're having to apply what they're learning in a real situation. It can be short and long. In the handout, by the way, I saw some of you taking pictures of the screen. Feel free to do that, but I want you to know when you get your certificate, you're going to have a document that comes with it that has a link to the presentation, a link to several of the research articles, a link to some of the websites that I've talked about. So that will be provided for you. But again, feel free to jot down or do those kinds of things. So this is where we're headed today in the short time that we have. But what I'd like to start out with is a question. And that question is, oh, I forgot to do this first. Do you ever do that? Yeah, me too. So 2 things while we do this today, before I do the question. You are giving us, whether you're in person or online, you're giving us a significant part of your day. You can't ever get this time back that you're going to give us this morning. So what I would love for us to do is to make it worthwhile. So here's the 2 things I'm going to ask you to do. Number 1, in this session, in the session coming on different learners, in the breakouts that we do, in the time that you have for coffee break and lunch, please think about the things that we're talking about. Please consider it. Think about your classroom. And then this is the really important one. From what you hear today, think about 1 or 2 things that you looked at and said, you know what, I think that might make a difference with my students. I think I could do it this way in my class and try it. Because again, I've been to a lot of PD sessions in my years as an educator. There are some that I went to, and then when I got done, I thought, I wish they had sent me the email. I don't want that to be this kind of session today. So let's think about how we can take action. Okay, so let's start out with student discourse, and here's the question I was going to give you a minute ago. At your table, in groups of 2 or 3, I'm going to give you 3 minutes. I know it's not a lot of time, but I'm going to give you 5% of the time I have this morning to discuss this question. What is the greatest challenge facing educators in the UAE today? For those of you online that are from other countries, think about it in your country. What is the greatest challenge in Kuwait or Qatar or the other countries that you're from? So you got about 3 minutes. What's the greatest challenge facing you today? That means you got to talk to each other. If you don't like each other, I didn't make you sit there. Okay, if I could bring your attention back up, would a few of you be willing to share at your table what you thought, what's the biggest challenge?
For me, it's different levels of students, especially now because of war. Many children are coming from different work, and like in my class, I have half of my class are ELL. They came from different countries and they don't know how to speak English. And I have my advanced students who knows English. So I think my biggest challenge was the different levels and different cultures that I'm having in this class.
Is that a challenge? Absolutely. Somebody else here to something that was different that, yes, please. So some of the relationship and communication with the parents. I would also add to that, the expectation of the parents is a challenge today. And all of you know that, yes?
Maybe work pressure and the requirements from the school. The teachers now are required to do lots of things all together, like, for example, alignment of the map with the CAT, with the content knowledge, with differentiating, with including the students of SEN and ELL. And this puts lots of load on the teacher to be able to accommodate all of these requirements in one class or in one course.
And that's absolutely true. The way our job has grown and the different aspects of what we're required to do, even compared to 10 years ago. And then one of the ones I've heard across as we've been doing this is just the engagement of students. You know, yes, you know what? Our world has changed. You know, when we wanted entertainment as a child, we went outside and played, or we watched TV, or we read a book. Students now are attached to that phone. Yes?
I think also one thing is the student attitude. Attitude of students towards learning. Like they're not interested, they don't have ambition to learn. Everything for them is easy. I Google it, I find the answer, I don't need to learn it. So I think the attitude of students also is very difficult these days.
By the way, I'm going to pause you because of time. One more, go ahead.
I want to highlight something very important, which is, for me at least, important, maybe not for others, to understand our role, being facilitators inside the classroom rather than being teachers, being in a learning mood rather being in a teaching mood.
Yes.
Thank you.
No, and I agree. So one of the things I want to look at today, all three of these areas go to this idea. Now, when I started out teaching science, or even when I was a student, one of the things we had to do in chemistry was memorize the periodic table. Anybody remember doing that? Yeah.
We still do.
And you know what? In today's time, what does it matter if I memorize the periodic table? But what I want the student to be able to do is be able to use the periodic table to say, if I take something out of column 2 and mix it with something out of column 7, what's going to happen? And I should be able to project that just because of what happens in those relationships. And what happens if I throw in something from column 8? Nothing, because those are the Nobel gases and they don't react. So, but it really is looking at that knowledge. So when we think about student discourse, by the way, one thing I want to mention here. When we did this, just now, this discussion at your tables, it was more than me just talking to you. Everybody in this room got to participate. One of the things about student discourse that's so important is the opportunity to be participants in learning rather than static listeners, because that's part of what we need. Go ahead, you had a comment you wanted to make.
Everybody talked about the engagement of the students and the attitude and all of that, but what I think something that we tend to overlook would be the intrinsic motivation.
Yes.
So for them, because we have multinational students, not only just local students or just expats from some the other Arab countries or the Gulf region. So basically, they have everything that they need and they want. This is what Mr. Khalid had provided. So basically, it's just I'm coming to school because my mom sent me, because I know that I'm gonna go. I'm gonna go here and then spend my weekend somewhere in the world and just come back and then that's it. I have everything, so I don't understand why I am physically at school, because I can learn anything. So that would move us to the connection between the teacher and the students, the relationship. That's what they need. They can learn anything from anywhere. It's just if you build that relationship in a very good way, even if you are teaching them something wrong, it would be just like, yes, we love this. So
I would moderate that on one point. You're absolutely right. Yeah. The motivation level of our students has changed and their life experience has changed. When we simply teach content, students don't connect with that because they think exactly what you said. Why do I have to learn this? Now, the one part I'll kind of modify a little bit, that teacher relationship is super important. My son, I have 3 girls and a boy. My girls were just intrinsically motivated. I didn't have to check if they were doing their work. They did it. My son, if he liked the teacher, he got an A. If he didn't like the teacher, he got a B or C, and then I had to check, are you turning your stuff in? Because he didn't do it. So one, that is super important. But you know what? Students still need the teacher for learning. I don't need the teacher for memorization. I don't need the teacher to look up a fact. But you know what? Students need to be able to know how do I take those facts and make them work? So you know what? You could take a kindergarten student, or I used to think, students working on their cell phone, that was for middle school and high school students, till I see my 6-year-old granddaughter on her mom's phone and all the stuff she can do with it. They could look up phonics, but I tell you what, word blending and syllabization, they need a teacher to help instruct them on that. So we're here to help make those connections in learning that are from a bigger aspect. Now, by the way, I'm thinking about the time as I do this. One of the things with student discourse is it can actually help with this. It can help with motivation. It can help connecting the teaching that we're doing to the learning the student needs to do. Because if you look at this, it's students talking on topic in an academic environment. The biggest thing about this, especially for our different language learners, it supports language acquisition and actual internalization of the meaning. You remember when you had to memorize the list of vocabulary words? We would have to do that in science and social studies. And you know what? Students, by the way, sometimes I wonder why we name things the way we do. Think about a fraction. What's the top of a fraction called? What's the bottom? Why is it called that? Fraction, I know, but fraction makes sense to me. You fracture something, it's in pieces, right? Numerator doesn't mean anything to anybody, but they can memorize the definition and never internalize the meaning of that word. Discourse helps them internalize meaning. So it's one of the reasons we want to do it. The second thing, why is it important, is when you look at this, it helps them go beyond their normal pattern of thinking. It helps them become part of the learning that's taking place, rather than a recipient that we're trying to fill up with things. Because the things that we're offering them are not the things, to your point, that intrinsically they want right now. Okay? Let me not go to math class and let me go play my game. All right? So it really helps with that, and it helps them think about it. One last thing about this, and then we're going to jump into some main points about this. The other thing about it, student discourse doesn't always mean 2 students talking to each other. Sometimes it's 2 students. Sometimes it's a group of students. Sometimes it's whole group. Sometimes it's student talking to teacher. So there's a number of different ways it can happen. Now, what I'd like to do is really quick give you 5 things that you need when you think about student discourse, because one of our fears, and teachers are afraid of student discourse, is that they won't be on topic and they'll be all over. And that is potential. We know that that's there. But number one, the first thing we have to do is choose a question or a topic where students have to really think about the idea or do something with it. Down here, juicy is an American phrase. It's got to be a juicy or an important idea. When I walk into class today, again, I taught science and math. If I walk in today to class and say, today we're going to study the Pythagorean theorem, what happens to the energy level in the room? Nothing, okay? Or if I walk in and say, we're going to look at cellular division today. I mean, that's not a juicy question. Let me give you just a couple examples really quickly of what I mean by this. These are out of our social studies or our history material. This top question, how does status shape life experience? That's actually the compelling question, we call it, on a topic on ancient Egypt. Because for our students, studying about ancient Egypt, why do I want to study? What relevance does that have in my world today? Now, we know differently because we come from a different perspective. But how does status shape life experience? The reason that's a compelling question, because in ancient Egypt, for those of you online that are from Egypt, I mean, it was a caste level society, and where you fell into that was very important about what you could do, how far you could proceed. Does status matter today? It absolutely does. In the US, when we look at a student profile in a district, there's like 15 different categories we look at. How are my students with free and reduced lunch performing? How are my intermediate EL students doing? We have a whole variety. And you know, one of the saddest things is when students that are second language students come into the US and they're beginner language learners, they're often categorized as special ed students. Why? Because they don't understand the language, not because they don't have the intelligence or the ability to actually do the work. So status still matters today. If you look at the second one, why does it matter where we live? This is actually out of a third grade social studies lesson on what are communities and the fact that we live in communities. But for students thinking about why does it matter where we live, there are a lot of answers to that. If I ask that question in this room, you could have a really great discussion on this one. Let me throw up another idea. This is out of English. What we've done with English and what most of you do is we do it topically. So when we do this is out of high school English, I think it's 10th grade. The actual compelling question for the unit we're getting ready to go into is what do we do when life gets hard? To your point, some of our students have not experienced what hard life is. And you know what? There's a lot of answers to that. The reason this is the question is because all of the texts that we're going to choose for the students to work with in this topic relate to this idea. Because we know that if we don't teach to learn, students are not going to be compelled. And the answer to this, you know what would you if it got hard? For a student to think about that, you know what? When life gets hard for some people, they quit. Other people turn inside themselves and shut people off from the outside. Other people look for a way to overcome. And within one individual, they don't always make the same choice. It's different. But it's a worthy question. Let me throw this one up here for you. Okay, this is a science question that comes out of a topic on biodiversity. How are animals in the ocean affected by things that happen in the sky? That's so much more relevant to a student than saying we're going to study biodiversity today, we're going to look at predator-prey relationships and put a food web or food chain together. Because now when I start working with those things, there's a context I pull that back to. So one of the things we have to do is we have to actually ask big questions that tie to the idea we're looking at. Here's number 2 and 3. Number 2, if we're going to start doing this on a more regular basis, we have to define what our classrooms around conversation are. That I wait my turn to speak. I mean, if I was doing it in a primary classroom, I would actually set an order up that they go in because they know this is my turn. I would have a discussion with my middle grade and higher grade levels on what appropriate comments are. Because if I'm in a group and we're discussing and the first thing I say is, boy, that was a stupid comment, what does that do to the discussion? And what does it do to that student that received that? So we do have to set some norms. Number 3 is really important. Set some goals and a timeline for the discussion. What are we looking for out of this discussion? But I think the time is exceptionally important. Now, if you're in a lower primary class, K1, 2, how much time should a class discussion, how much time should student discourse take for any one question I ask them? 1 or 2 minutes? Yeah. I mean, and the other part of it is, you know, my ideas I'm generating may not go so far. So if I give them a 5-minute discussion period, not a good thing. High school, really my recommendation, 5 minutes. 5 minutes max. Okay? Yeah, because what happens is if it's longer than 5 minutes, now I'm talking about what's happening Friday night and what happened in the football game and who won and all this kind of stuff. And we just know that. And you have to target it. The other thing when you set time is it promotes a feeling, oh, we need to do this. Now, does that mean it's going to work perfectly every time? No. In fact, I'm a firm believer, take a timer and put it up there. We got 5 minutes, guys. Let's get started. Okay? But it sets a clear expectation. That also is important for our learners to know what the expectation is. Okay? Number 4, this is a big one up here, only because there's a lot of examples in here. One thing when you do student discourse, you don't have to let it go all 5 minutes without saying something. In fact, it's good for the engagement to have places where you stop and make a comment or you draw their attention. Now, there are different ways you can do that, okay? One, you know what, guys? I want you to stop for a minute. I'm going to give you 30 seconds. Think about what was just said at your table or in your discussion. What was really important? Gives opportunity for students to digest. Gives opportunity for multilingual students or learners to think about a minute and catch up. The second one, I might set where I call up, you guys, we've been having a discussion. Number 1, number 2, number 3. What were your ideas? Just go. Let them do that. Or I might just do something like this down at the bottom. What makes you think that? What idea have you come up for? Why? Do you have any evidence behind that? Or is it just your thought? What that does is it reintroduces the engagement and it clarifies the point of the discussion. It keeps them on task. And then there's one more that goes along with this. To wrap up the discussion, you need to really come down to what was the key points? What are the takeaways from this? If you're going to do student discourse, please don't do this. Please don't have them discuss and say, okay, now let's go on. Because what that just told the student is this discussion really didn't have any purpose. So one of the reasons I asked the question earlier about what the greatest challenge is, I wanted you to have an opportunity to do a little discourse. And then what did we do? We came back and said, let's hear a few of the ideas that came out. Why? Because you know what? Every one of those ideas we heard were different. And you might think then, well, you know what? Maybe engagement is a little more important. But these are all challenges we have. Now, one last thing about student discourse. By the way, I think you can tell today, taking 3 different ideas in 1 hour, the point is not to go and dive totally in depth. It's just to get you thinking about, is this something I should do? Now, there's 2 strategies I just want to mention with this. One of the best ways to do discussion is think, pair, share. That's not new to any of us, okay? Why is it so important? Number 1, it gives the student a chance to collect their thoughts. Number 2, by the way, again, for English language learners, really important that they get the minute to think about it, to internalize the question, and think about how they might do that in a language other than their first language. Secondly, the pair now allows every student to share. The sharing part, then, that applies kind of really the credibility to why we had the discussion in the first place, because we all get... Now, there's a bunch of ways you can do this, and you guys have probably done them all. Think pair, pair, share, where I pair up 2, and then those 2 become 4. Sometimes you do it where they have multiple ideas and you got to come out now with the one the group thinks the most important, and then we're going to share that out whole group. The second one, I'm not going to go into this, but I want to identify, and in the handout that I have an article on this that describes this. MLR stands for Math Language Routine. You don't have to use these just in mathematics, though. They came out of Stanford University, out of Berkeley, California, based on the research they did in helping multilingual learners actually internalize learning with the language. But they're great for discussion purposes. The first one, let me just mention two of these. The first one, stronger and clearer each time, is when they first give that response, often it's not terms of the academic language we need them to be using. So when he state it, we give them another minute to go back to that question and say, how could I say it using the words that we learned in class? Every time I say it, it's a little bit more strongly specified so the understanding is clear. Number 5 here is a great strategy to use with our students. Co-crafting questions and problems. Now that we had discussion, come up with 3 questions that would deepen our understanding of the idea you just came up with. When students have to create the question, it really helps them internalize learning. But these strategies are other things you can use in discussion, or you remember how we said that discussion should have a purpose, a focus? These can be the focus. When you think about compare and connect, here's the idea. I want you to compare and connect these ideas. That then becomes a discussion around our question. Yes, because that's what our students need to do today, is they need to do that. We're going to move to the second one, instruction and routines. Okay? Instruction and routines, what is it? A routine is simply this. We all know that. How many of you have a pretty specific morning routine on school days? When you get up, you do these things, okay? Yeah. My mother would tell you, she's 90 years old, she would tell you the first thing you have to do when you get up is have your coffee. Does anybody agree with that? Okay. Now, the sad thing is she doesn't like coffee. What she likes is a lot of milk with a little bit of coffee. And in fact, I saw her a couple weekends ago, and I poured her coffee, and I'm not kidding, I put this much milk in it. And she takes the first drink and says, this doesn't have enough cream in it. You need more. And I said, you don't like coffee. You know, you like milk with some coffee flavor. But an instruction or routine on this side is performed as a part of a regular procedure. Notice this, for a special reason. Now, really quickly, I want to give you a few examples what I mean by this. Routines, just by the word, are not things we do one time. It's something we do regularly in our classroom. Let me start out with literacy. I'm going beyond myself. These are why they're important. I'm not going to read all these, but notice the first one, they organize the instruction. Down here, they maximize student participation. I think this goes to your point earlier. They maximize instructional time and minimize how much we're up front talking. So in literacy, in the U.S., we've heard a lot about the science of reading in the last 2 years. And there was a gentleman named Dr. Scarborough who tried to take all the parts of literacy and put them in a sequential context. And really what he did is called Scarborough's rope. Nisreen in the ELA session is going to talk about this. There's 2 parts, word recognition. We do a lot of this at primary grades. Phonemic awareness, phonics, syllabalization. Then we go up to language comprehension, which includes all those things. But we do know this, if they can't do word recognition, they're going to struggle the rest of their lives with comprehension. So in this, we created some routines. Now, you don't have to be using Wonders, but Wonders is our elementary or our primary literacy program. And in Wonders, we actually created a series of instructional routines that are integrated into our program. And we actually have a book that lays them all out and how you do them. Now, I just want to show you in K5 how many different routines we integrate into the program. Notice for word recognition or word work, for reading, for writing and grammar, for our ELL students, for our language acquisition students, there's a series of routines that students can internalize. The best thing I can do is give you an example of this, okay? Let's talk about phonemic awareness. For those of you that are high school people, phonemic awareness is just the fact that students recognize what sounds are and what letters they go with. That's phonemic awareness. Because if they don't understand what the sound is, they can't make words. When they hear words, they can't recognize them, okay? Now, we have a strategy that goes along. This is called syllable segmentation. So it's important that students understand how those sounds together, when they join and blend, when they're separate. Whenever we do a routine, we always do three things. Number one, we explain what the routine is. So in this routine, we're going to listen for the number of beats we hear in a word. Each beat will have one vowel sound. We're going to clap each time we hear a beat. These beats are called syllables. Okay? So we're going to listen for the sounds. Every time we hear a sound that's a beat, we're going to clap when we hear it. Okay? Yep. So I'm going to explain it. Number two, we're going to model it. Listen now. I'm going to clap the beats or syllables. So if I do the word basket, basket. Try that with me. Basket, basket. I model it. And then number three, we're going to do some guided instruction. We're going to do it together. Now, when we get this, notice we're going to do this. I want you to clap with me. Let's try these words. Monday, Monday. Let's go to the next one. Tumble, tumble. Now, I'm going to stop here just for a second. All three words we did had two syllables, right? When we get to desk, I know, but I can see some of my students trying to think, deska, deska, because everything had two. So you got to mix it up. Now, here's why the routine is so important. Next week, we come to some new words. Yeah, and you know what? Now I don't have to explain it. Now I don't have to model it. Guys, remember we're going to do the beats, okay? Let's take the word yesterday. Yesterday. Okay, you guys take the next one, potato. Okay, so really that's what's so important about a routine. Now, we look at this, students can internalize this and they start to think that way. I don't have to explain it again. Let me go to a higher level. This we actually use K all the way up through 12. Dr. Doug Fisher is one of our authors. All of his research has been about actually effective literacy. One of the routines that we build in is close reading. Close reading typically involves a first read or a cold read where students read and they're just looking for context. What is this about? And then we come back and reread with text-dependent questions. They have to look for things. By the way, for those of you that don't teach literacy, this strategy in science and math and social studies, super important. Look at it. Now I want you looking for these things. Because you know what? When our students read, they don't read really looking for anything. They're not trying to figure out what's happening and what's most important and not important. This allows them to look for things, and it really builds to comprehension because they are looking for something. So one of the strategies we use or routines we use is called text, cite, write. Again, if I started this out, I would explain it. I would model it, then we would do it together. So in this one, we've done the cold read. We're coming back for our close read. Read the question prompts, what's that thing you're looking for, and then read the text looking for those. Turn to a partner and talk about these questions. Okay? Number two, cite. In this one, we use a graphic organizer, but you don't have to use that. Cite any evidence you found to support the answer for that question. And then number three, let's write about it. So talk, cite, write. That's a routine. After I explain it the first time or second time, I don't have to do it again. Let me change subjects for you. Let me do math. These are a series of number kinds of routines that we use in Reveal Math, but they could be used in any classroom. I'm going to start out with sense making. By the way, who are my math teachers in the room? Okay. This one right here is one of the best books you can ever get about math pedagogy. It's called The 5 Practices for Orchestrating Productive Mathematical Discussions. It goes to student discourse, okay? Now, let me take you sense making. These are the 5 different sense making routines we use. You don't have to just use them in math, though. Notice and wonder. How are they the same? How are they different? Which one doesn't belong? Is it always true? Now, numberless word problems is kind of a math thing, but I think you could probably use in other areas. And here's what will help this make sense. Let me give you a couple examples. We use these at the beginning of a lesson. And the reason that we do this, like this one, which one does not belong with the others? Now, don't say anything. Turn to the person next to you. Online, think about this. Think about which number doesn't belong. Just tell the person next to you. Now, tell them why. Why doesn't it belong? Anybody pick 10? Why? Only 2-digit number. Anybody pick 5? Why? Yes, only odd number. Anybody pick 2? Why might I pick 2? 2 is the only number on here less than 5. What about 8? 2 times 5 is 10. That leaves 8 on the outside, okay? Now, this one is which one doesn't belong. The reason we start math lessons with this, some of our students are afraid of math. They have what I call math anxiety. Some of my teachers in the room also have a little bit of math anxiety, okay? What this does, think about this for a second. It lets every student come in and have a voice in math class right from the beginning, but it also engages them in student discourse. Thing about these, they don't take long. Yeah, it's not a 10-minute. And again, think pair share. Think about it for a minute. Which one do you think? But the other thing I want you to think about here, there are different answers, which is okay, but students have to justify their answer. That kind of thinking is what we want for students. So let me give you another one. This is in geometry in high school. It's called notice and wonder. What do you notice? What do you wonder? Think about this in history. If you were using a primary source that's an image, what do you notice? What do you wonder? In this one, as a math teacher, I notice that I have parallelograms. I notice that S is a reflection of M, okay? You know, I can get into that part of it. Some of my students might just say, there are different colors, but they still get an opportunity to come in. As a math person, I also look at it and say, what is O doing up there? Who threw that point into my nice graph? This is in fractions in 3rd grade. How are they the same? How are they different? The lesson is actually on equal parts. And students get to, so what you're noticing here, what we're doing, even though there are multiple answers, tie directly to the concept. So I'm easing students into the lesson is what I'm doing with these. This is one in high school, algebra, with functions. A lot of you look at this and say, what is that? No, you remember this stuff. For this one, most students would choose the last one. Why? It's the only one with a fraction, okay? Some students that are a little more mathematically oriented might say C, because n is an exponent in all the other ones. So you get the idea. The second set we use are called number routines. Now this first set, sense-making routines, is all about introducing and letting students participate. Number routines are about fluency. One of the most important things in math for students to be successful is not memorization, but number sense. What do numbers mean? So I'll give you a couple examples. In the handout, I have a document that explains all of these, so you can look and say, which one do I want to try? Now, something about a routine, though. The first time we use one of these, like what's another way to write this? The first time we use it several days in a row, because otherwise they don't internalize the routine and then I have to repeat it every time. So we'll use it. You know what, same thing with the other ones like notice and wonder. When we first introduce it, we'll use it several times in a row. So they get used to that routine. Now let me give you a couple examples of these, okay? About how much? Estimate the difference. So if you look at the first one, 846 and 668, take just a second in your mind, about how much would that be? And in fact, if you don't mind doing me a favor, jot it down on your paper. About how much is 846 and 668? Just jot it down, okay? By the way, there's not one answer to this. It depends on how the student thinks about numbers. So, for me, I look at this one and say 846 is about 850, and 668, well, it's around 650, so it's about 200. Other people would go to the 10 place. Yes. So it's really thinking, do you know what these numbers mean? And again, these are quick. When you do this, you normally do 2 or 3 different examples. You don't want to do it just once. Do it 2 or 3 times. So I'm actually thinking about it. Then what I do, turn to your partner. What did you guys say? A couple different answers. Let me give you another one, okay? Is it reasonable? Is it reasonable? This is a yes or no. Is it reasonable? Okay, 15 and a half divided by 4 3/4 is about 5. Is that reasonable? Now, give them the thing you want to do with this. Give them a little time to think about it. Because immediately if an answer is shouted out, guess what happens? The thinking stops. So that's one of our norms, is we don't shout it out, we wait. And in this one, you know, again, as a math person, 15 and a half is about 15. 4 3/4 is about 5. 15 divided by 5 is 3. 5 is not very reasonable, okay? But we're giving you a number sense. I'll throw one more up here. This is my favorite one in math. Decompose it in 3 different ways. Not just once, 3 different ways. And here's why. If they do it one time, how would you decompose it? Yeah, I take the whole number on one side and the fraction on the other side, okay? Now, I'm going to make them look at other ways to do it, okay? So really, it's all dealing with number sense. This is would you do it in your head, and how could you do it in your head? And if a student actually understands the math, then they can start doing mental math. But what I want you to see with these, it's about fluency and it's about number sense. There's a variety of ways we do this. We actually include these in all of our K-8 material. And it's something you could do anytime during the day. Let me do a social studies one real quick, and then I'll do a science one, and we'll move on, okay? Social studies, about primary sources. That's a big part, analyzing the primary source and looking at it. So the first thing I do is I inspect it. Second thing I do, what evidence do I have that supports what I'm thinking? And then number 3, is this like other things that we've seen or looked at? Now, this one is exceptionally important in our world today. Let me tell you why, because somebody mentioned it just a minute ago. If a student has a question, what do they do now? They Google it. Or they ask Siri or Alexa or whoever, okay? Yes, and they can immediately get an answer. And Mimi and I were talking earlier, one of the things that's happened in the last year at such an accelerated pace is AI. But it's really interesting because some of the studies that they've done, you know, if you ask AI a certain question, write me an essay on, you know, global warming. And I mean, AI will do it, right? The thing that's interesting, though, is they've shown, because what AI does is go out to all of these thousands of sources and gather information, it pulls in things that aren't accurate. Our students, one of the most important skills we can teach them is how do you determine what's accurate and what's not accurate. And the thing is with history, history is always written from the perspective of the person writing it. So if you were looking at U.S. history in an American history book, it would talk about how great the American Revolution was that founded our country. If you went back in a British history book, it would talk about these terrorists and them, them rebelling against the government. But you know what? We need our students. That's why, how does this look like other sources? How do you compare it, okay? This is one we use in actually K-12 in history. This came out of something called the C3 framework. And it looks at, when we look at a big question in social studies, like that question, how does status affect people's lives? We're going to do 4 things. First, we're going to generate student questions. That makes students part of the learning. Secondly, we're going to look at all dimensions of that history. Because you know what? You can't look at historical events without looking at culture, without looking at geography, because it all plays into that. What kind of government was there? That's where the civics parts come in. It all plays into the understanding. History is not isolated events. Then evaluate the sources that you're looking at, which we just talked about. Look for the evidence. And finally, having them communicate their conclusion. And is there some kind of output you're asking for? But this is an instruction routine. Let me give you one last one. This is math, or this is science, rather. It's called claim evidence reasoning. Again, you know what? We use this in science, but you could use it in anything. Here's the big question. Make a claim about it. Now, as we do our learning through this topic, let's look for evidence to support or refute that claim. And you know what? It's all right if your claim isn't right. Because our students, what they're going to want to do is keep their claim regardless of whatever and try to make the evidence fit it. And they need to know it's okay to change it. As I do everything in science, as I do an experiment, as I read, as we work with a simulation and watch a video, I'm looking for evidence to support or refute this. You know what it does? It ties the whole topic together and gives purpose to it. And then finally, I end up at the end, so here's my final claim, and this is the reasoning why that's my claim. So think about that strategy up here. Now, you didn't see that last slide. I'm going to skip it real quick, okay? Because I'm going to wrap up in just a few minutes. I want to touch on this just briefly. Student discourse and instructional routines can be separate, but generally they're closely tied together. Most instructional routines have discourse as part of them. Really important to do. This last one I want to touch on is mastery-based learning. And this is something we're seeing get some momentum in the U.S. It's still in less than 10% of our schools across the country. And it looks at what are we actually evaluating students on. Now, I'm going to give you some specific examples, but what they mean by mastery-based learning is this. It's the idea that we're going to ensure a student understands the current topic before we go to the next topic. Now, in our traditional classroom, we can look at that and say, that doesn't work. I've got too much to cover. Went back to your statement. How many different things do we have to do? So how do I wait for a student to learn? We'll touch on that in a minute. This is why I'm saying this is kind of out there. I think we really need to think about how we even put our students in grades. Because what we're doing is we're taking students that are all over the board and having them learn concepts that many of them aren't ready to learn. Some have already learned. So it thinks about that. The second thing it does, it's going to go to Nabib and Reem's session on different learners. It actually says, how can we support students based on where they're at? Okay? That's the idea. Now, I called it mastery-based learning. You're going to see some different words out there that describe the same thing. Some of those words are standards-based grading or standards reference grading, competency-based learning. Those just mean really the same thing. The standards-based grading is how we grade mastery-based learning. Now, just a warning. This is not something you go back to a school and do tomorrow. This is something you spend a couple years. Yes, and it's not something you as an individual teacher go back in your classroom and do. This has to be a school or a district or company idea. Now, let me give you a specific example that pulls this out. So, I'm going to give you 2 students. One student using traditional grading, traditional instruction, okay? The second student using mastery-based learning and standards-based grading. So I'm going to give you a situation here, okay? Here's student A. 3 quizzes in this topic and then my unit assessment. So first quiz, I got a 10%. Man, I didn't do well. Second one, I got a 50%, getting a little better. Third one, I got a 70%. And on the unit exam, I got an 85. What's happening to the learning? It's progressing. But in a traditional grading system, what grade does this student get? Now, if I do a straight average, they get a 53%. Now, we all know this. We can weight it different ways. Quizzes are this. But you know what we're grading? We're grading all of the work the student did to come up. Now, what does that 53% tell me about this student? Not much. Yes. Now, let's take it from the other approach. We're looking at mastery-based learning. We're not using an A, B, C, D. We're not using the percent. What we're looking at is almost a rubric. Level 1, they're developing their understanding. Number 2, they're approaching what they should know for the grade level. Number 3, they're at grade level. They're right where they should be. And number 4, they're beyond it. Now, this student got the same grades. Oh, by the way, notice this one. Number 3 is not a B. Number 3 in our tradition is actually an A. They are at grade level. Now, this student's grade would be a 3. Because notice what they did on the unit assessment. They understood the material. So when we think about that, in a traditional report card, this is what a parent gets. And by the way, if you ever started to investigate this, you have to educate your parents on why we're doing this. Because for how long have we been using percentages and A, B, C, D, so on? For a long time. And if they're used to that, that's what they're going to look for. Somebody had mentioned this. You know what? When I was in school, if I got in trouble at school, I was in trouble at home. And if I got a C or a D on my report card, I had to explain what I was doing. There's a switch in that many times today. Now it's, why aren't you doing your job? Because my student doesn't have an A. Okay? And so some of this is really helpful. So that 95%, what does that mean? Look at a standards-based or mastery learning report card. Here are the things you should be able to do mathematically, and where is that student in their ability to do it? You know who this also helps? It helps a parent, because you know what? My student is struggling with, I can define a number sentence. They're approaching level, but they need some support. It also helps the student. The percent to a student doesn't mean a whole lot. So it actually looks at the difference between this. In fact, with mastery-based learning, the real assessment that is used is the summative assessment. If they struggled earlier with the formative assessments, but they ended up where they needed to be, that's success. So it looks at that summative assessment. Now, by the way, this is all in the handout, so you want to go back and spend some time looking at it. This is a school that actually went to this in the States. It's Wichita Canvas. They have probably about 40,000 students in the district. So, I mean, we're talking a sizable district. They took 3 years to do this. 3 years. I mean, they didn't do it overnight because it's a big shift. I'm going to go here. This is actually a statement by Robert Marzano supporting this. He's a big educational researcher. The answer is quite simple. Grades are so imprecise, they're almost meaningless. Yes?
Is the average.
Yes.
So how we can move while we have multiple students inside the class, and we need your advice in this regard.
So 2 different ways to do that.
Yes,
okay?
please.
Number 1 is traditionally what we do is a student is this old, they're in 10th grade. Okay? And when you're in 10th grade, you're going to study these things. The last job I was in a high school. I was the dean of students. I was working with all of our students that were at risk. So they had failed 6th, 7th, and 8th grade math, and we're putting them in Algebra 1. What's going to happen to that student? They're not going to be successful, okay? So the two things we have to think about is it doesn't mean because in this grade or this grade, I need to be studying these ideas. So we need to, number one, make classes more flexible. Now, that takes time again. But the other thing that we need to do is this, right here. By the way, thank you for the question because it led right to this, okay? Our instruction needs to be divided into 3 segments. Number 1 is core. Core are the grade level standards. This is what we need the students to be able to master. When we write, let's say a science book or a math book or anything that we create, we're focused on the core instruction. Now, we do the second part, which is differentiation, and that's what we're going to spend the workshop on. I know I have some students that are missing some prerequisite skills. I need to do some work with that before they can do the on-grade level. But how many levels can a teacher differentiate on? 2, 3, you know. When we write our materials, we build in resources to differentiate, but they go down to the prerequisite skill below that, and they extend learning a bit. So maybe a grade level below and pushing a little bit ahead, okay? Because they're focused on core, right? But we build in differentiation. We have to differentiate for our students for those prerequisites. But the third part to me is the part that's missing in a lot of our schools, and I've got to wrap up because I don't want to push any more into the time, is personalization. There are 2 ways to do personalization. Because, to your point, if I have 30 students in my class, they are on 30 different levels. Depending on the topic, it may be my advanced student that's missing an idea. What personalization is I target that student's need. Now, how can I do that with all these students in my class? There's 2 answers to that. One answer is what I call intentional intervention. That we have a time designated in our school where we use a specific resource to target the missing knowledge the student has. Now, one of those types, many different companies have something like this, is called direct instruction. I'm pulling them out, they do an initial assessment, I group students by those missing skills, and the way the program works is I focus on those. And what we see with direct instruction is students that are 2, 3, 4 grade levels behind can actually make up multiple grade levels in 1 year with those skills. But the second way, if we don't have that time, is to use some of the adaptive technology that's out there today. Now, I'm going to give you one example. We have a program that goes along with math called ALEX. ALEX, students take an initial 30-minute assessment. It identifies what they know, what they don't know, and what they're ready to learn. So for each individual student, it targets those things. Okay, let me finish this and then I'll come to your question, okay? But it targets that. We have similar programs in literacy, but it's the only way that we can take that other 20% and help them stay up with what we're doing, okay? Now, one last thing. Again, if you were going to think about this as a school, there is a process you have to go through to actually start looking at that, okay? One, working departments, what are the things that we students have to master in order to be proficient? And then breaking those down into specific skills, looking at summative assessment, and then the one that's not out here is your whole marketing campaign with teachers and parents about why we're making this shift. But it really does impact students' lives to do that. Your question.
Actually, I would like to ask you, can I make the high achiever students involved with me?
Oh, absolutely.
In order to be able to responsible for all the groups as well, in order to interact with me and to get the right answer as well.
Yeah, and the comment was, can I help students be involved in helping do that? Absolutely. One of the things that will support a higher achieving student and keep them interested is to support somebody else. And you know what? By explaining it, their learning actually takes another step. Right, go ahead.
I wanted to think in a different way. We are talking about differentiation.
Yes.
But you know that there's new trends like the universal curriculum approach, where we are individualizing learning for each student inside the classroom. If we visualize it, these things are now, you know, if you look into, if I want to visualize it, because it's creating a sensitive environment inside the classroom. You're standing on this, and you can see up to your level. If I put another box and let someone who is shorter than you to stand on it, you are going to see both of you. If I move all these, because of the wall, you cannot see. If I move all these, I put a net or a glass, you can see. So this is the universal curriculum design.
Correct.
My question, how can we link this to the classroom environment and how we can create an environment that is not sensitive in the sense of when you group students, it will create in a way or another a sort of, he's smarter than me. He is sitting here.
So one thing I would think about that helps with this, because we have put a stigma, grades are a stigma. If you get an A, you like that, that's good. But if you get a C, how does that make you feel? You know, we say it's average, but it's not really average. What do we want? What does everybody want? I want the A, but I don't want to work for it. I just want the A, right? Okay? So we've created that learning environment. When reporting is not punitive, like in this, I'm at a 2, I'm almost there, I just need to work at it a little bit more. We actually take away some of the punitive nature. But it is a culture aspect. It's not only universal learning design, it's also a mind shift community change in our schools where we celebrate where students reach landmarks. But, you know, this is what's so important about this, and I've got to stop. This is what's so important about this. If I take a student and put them in a class where the expectation is 2 to 3 grade levels above what I've learned so far, I am not going to be successful. And what happens is 2 things. I get farther behind, and I'm not interested in school at all. Because when you're, you know, we've all experienced this. I'm amazed when I travel abroad how many people speak English. But I've been in places where people don't. I have no understanding of the concept of what they're saying. And you not only feel excluded, and that's not the intention of anybody, but you know, you think about that. When we put a student in a math classroom and they're missing 2, 3 prior grades of learning, it's like foreign language. I don't even know what you're talking about. So why should I be interested? But if I can take a student and get them in the place that they need to be, I actually can see myself catching up and know I can get here. But it's a big mind. The reason I put this one in, I already told you, you can't go back and do this tomorrow. But we as educators need to start thinking about it in our schools and think about how can we make some of those changes. So really, I want to end with this. We're going to shift now. It'll take us about 2 minutes. During those 2 minutes, what I would ask you to do is at your table, think about this right here. And with your colleagues, what can you take back with you right now and do in your classrooms and your schools? What idea? It goes back to, I asked you to do a couple things, thoughtfully consider, evaluate, take action. What action can you take back to your school as a result of our discussion this morning? I'm going to stop there. Thank you. I'll be talking to many of you later in the science session. We go. Nabib and Reem are going to come up and get set up. But at your table right now, please take that thought and have a little bit of discussion around it.